when Thomas Homer Dixon agreed to do this, I was just thrilled. I knew it was going to be a success no matter what else happened today. Thomas Homer Dixon, one of our country's most distinguished and original thinkers and one of our most influential public intellectuals. His work is marked by its interdisciplinary approach to the illumination and elucidation of some of society's most complex and intractable political, economic, and security challenges. His research focuses on the threats to global security in the 21st century, including economic instability, climate change, energy scarcity, ideological polarization, and mass violence. And that's just the easy stuff. He brings his expertise in systems theory and conflict analysis to this work, and most notably, he aims not merely to identify some of these epic civilizational problems, but actually to solve them. Tad is executive director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University. Previously, he held a university research chair in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, and he was the CG chair of Global Systems at the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo. He was the founding director of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation, and prior to that, the founding director of the Trudeau Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Toronto, where he held the George Ignatieff Chair in Peace and Conflict Studies. He's the author of a number of important works, including Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril, The Upside of Down, Catastrophe, Creativity, and the Renewal of Civilization, and of course, The Ingenuity Gap, a book that influenced so many of us, a paradigm-shifting work which puts in evidence the critical gap between our need for practical and innovative ideas to solve complex problems and our actual supply of those ideas. And as you can tell, he also comes up with fantastic book titles. Very catchy. And as you'll hear today, Tad identifies the ingenuity gap as one of 4 causal mechanisms responsible for bringing about ideological polarization, social division, populism, and democratic decline. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Homer Dixon.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's truly marvelous to be here. I want to start by thanking Peter, Section 1, Canadian International Council, and also, of course, Massey College. And I've been reflecting a bit on this occasion personally over the last few days, coming back here. I was at the University of Toronto for almost 20 years. It was a marvelous time in my career and my life, and I'm very wistful about having moved on from that stage. But one of the greatest honors I had on leaving Toronto, John Fraser nominated me as a senior fellow here in the college. And over the last nearly 20 years or so, I've sat in this room many times with scholars from around the world, talking to them about the challenges that our species in Canada face. And I think this is one of those places where we achieve something of a reconciliation between the atomizing effect of liberalism that we talked about earlier and the importance of grounded community. This is a place of remarkable community, going back to the memories of Robertson Davies and his history here. And I'm so thrilled that my friend James Orbinski has become the new principal, which we call the principal now, no longer the master. And this really is, I think, a marvelous honor, James, and kind of a synthesis of everything you've accomplished in your life that you can bring back to this community in Toronto. So this is a very special moment for me to be talking about some issues that I think we all feel extraordinarily deeply about, but are having trouble making sense of. And maybe today my remarks will help us make a little bit of sense of them. I want to put my comments today and I'll start with a presentation in a few minutes, in a bit of personal context about where I've been over the last 10 days. So last week, I was in Perth, Ontario with the Polycrisis research team of the Cascade Institute. I'll say a little bit more about the Cascade Institute in a few minutes. But that team focuses on global systemic risk, and we were building out, after almost 2 years of work, we were in the very critical stage of developing essentially a quasi-mathematical model of the integration of 11 different global systems and how they affect each other: climate, economy, geopolitics, trade, relations, artificial intelligence, and how they affect each other, and the different stability zones that the world might encounter, both positive and negative, what you could call equilibria, in 2040 or so. And after a week's work, we punched the button on the computer program and crunched all the numbers and came up with a provisional set of answers. Of the 4 million possible states that the computer program evaluated, there were 9 that were stable, essentially stable equilibria, in complexity terms, homeostatically stable. 8 of them were bad news, but there was one positive one there. And that's something of a signal of hope. It shows us that there are possibilities to pull out of what appears to be a very serious spiral, both within our society and globally. So I was there doing this polycrisis work. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes. And then I wasn't expecting I was going to stay the weekend here and come to this event this week in Toronto. But just over 2 weeks ago, our son, Sarah Wolf, who's my partner, and our son together, Ben Homer Dixon, put his name forward as a Green candidate in the federal election in a riding just adjacent to Elizabeth May's. And it happens to be a riding where the Greens, who are not doing well across the country, as you know, have something of a shot. The prospects of him being elected are actually very, very slim. He's only 20 years old. He's in first-year university. I flew home to work with him on training for 2 really tough all candidates meetings, that one of which was on Sunday and one of which was last night in Victoria, with real professionals, real pros, political pros beside him. So a very intimate encounter with the practicalities of democracy, of electoral democracy. And this opportunity arose, and Ben took some time. He had to make a decision very quickly, but within a day he had decided he was going to try it. He is inevitably completely at sea, but he understands that. He's learning very fast. And I think that people have reacted in the all candidates meetings, which tend to be populated by people who have a lot of gray hair like me, have reacted as this is an example of extraordinary, of the kind of bravery we need among young people nowadays. And I'm hoping that he will be an example for perhaps some other young people. We have talked about the problems of the alienation of youth. So I flew back here yesterday, and I should just say one thing that I've learned, and this is an aside from this process. The Conservative candidate in Esquimalt Saanich Sooke, which is the riding that Ben is competing in, is not present at any of the all candidates meetings. So we have the Liberal, we have the NDP, we have a Communist, we have Ben from the Green Party. But the Conservative candidate, and I see no reason not to mention his name, Grant Cool, has just not turned up. He had an supposedly off the record conversation with a journalist, which is not a smart move, by the way. And I understand, because I think this should be public information, that the Conservative candidates have been advised not to talk to the media. So that's why he's not turning up at these all candidates debates. I think that has significant bearing on the things that we're talking about today. So that's just an aside. So Lucan Way talked about how he is normally an optimist, but he's feeling very pessimistic in some respects. I would say I'm normally a pessimist, but I'm feeling a little bit more optimistic. And I'd just like to point out that There is a question mark at the end of the title to this event. Liberal democracy in the rearview mirror, question mark. And I think we need to keep that question mark in mind. The border between the United States and Canada, it's a point that I've made in a number of forums over the last little while, is now a frontier in the global battle for democracy, liberal democracy. And I would say something radical. It's not a military frontier, but it's a frontier in some respects that's just as important as the frontier in eastern Ukraine. And I don't think that has been recognized by a lot of people in the world yet, outside of Canada, and I'm not even sure most Canadians realize it. I wrote to Martin Wolf, who's the leading economics commentator at the Financial Times recently. We've gotten to know each other over the last couple of years, and it was a rather urgent plea. In fact, I think I had in my subject line, urgent plea. I said, you know, Canada probably can't survive as a liberal democracy if Europe falls, if the liberal democracies in Europe fall. But I don't think Europeans realize that if Canada falls, it's going to make the project of defending liberal democracy in Europe much harder. That this is an important battleground now. And so the question is, how are we going to fight that battle? What exactly are we fighting to defend? Now, I should say that this was an extraordinary series of presentations this morning. I just filled up pages and pages of notes. And Peter, your introductory keynote was absolutely masterful, and I felt almost like going home at that point. But you would have been annoyed with me. But I think we can say that in context of the conversation so far, the battle is clearer now, and it's been joined, and the outcome is not yet determined. And I think we need to find out strategically how to fight that battle. That's the critical question in front of us. And I want to provide a framework, as you'll see, for thinking about how strategically to fight the battle to defend not just Canadian democracy, liberal democracy, but liberal democracy globally. So let me say, with that as background, a little bit about the Cascade Institute. We are, I hate the term, but it's the best thing out there. We are a think-do tank. We are action-oriented. We operate within an urgency paradigm, and we apply complexity science to try to identify both dangerous nonlinearities, dangerous cascades, if you will, and potentially positive cascades. In fact, we divide our work into two categories. Anticipating pernicious cascades. The polycrisis work is about that. That model I talked about is an exercise in foresight, trying to understand why it is that so many things seem to be going wrong in the world simultaneously. But we also have another bucket of work, which is triggering virtuous cascades. Looking for places within complex systems, social, economic, technological, institutional systems where relatively small interventions can make a really big difference. And that's called identifying what we call HLIPs, high leverage intervention points. My work in this area started when I was at the University of Toronto. It continued at the University of Waterloo, and it's now being realized by an extraordinary team of people, of 20 people now in the Cascade Institute. Our headquarters is on Vancouver Island, but we are spread across the country. And in many respects, I think the challenge that we are addressing here at this conference, and also that I'm addressing within the little presentation I'm going to do in a minute, is really about moving from anticipating pernicious cascades to triggering virtuous cascades. How can we understand the causal dynamics of the situation we face deeply enough that we can figure out where those leverage points are? So I'll talk a lot about causation. Within complexity science, causation is what you would call in fancy academic language an ontological prior. In other words, it's a basic building block of the way we look at the world. So I'm going to talk a lot about causation. We are erratically interdisciplinary, which has been my situation to a fault throughout much of my career. We have everybody from neuroscientists to anthropologists involved in our team. But we try to anchor our understanding in a detailed causal map of whatever problem we're trying to address. So I think that's all by way of introduction, but I'd like to talk now about this document, which is on our website. And I think there was a link in the materials that you received. There's an updated version on the website now. The link to the materials you received was to a previous version. I was very helpfully advised by one of the members of the audience here, Lauren Johnson, with the Ivy Foundation, that it needed to be decomplexified a bit, which is always something I need to hear. And so this version has not lost any content, but it's more accessible in pretty important ways. So I'm pleased that it's available now. The team just produced it last week. Let me give you a little bit of background to this. And again, I'm going to invoke Lauren's name. We were together in Montreal at the end of January, talking to some philanthropies about polarization processes, ideological polarization processes in Canada. And what became clear after the conversations is that all of us were a bit at sea with respect to the nature of the problem we're facing. That we weren't really comprehending where those leverage points are and where we should make interventions. So Lauren suggested we need a strategic framework, and I said, okay, I'll put the team on it. This is the end of January. I went back and we had an all hands meeting the following Monday, and I brought everybody on board, including our geophysicists and geologists, and I said we need to start thinking about this. And we have geophysicists and geologists because we have a major, as you'll hear in a moment, project on geothermal power. And it was really quite a remarkable exercise, and I think the result was terrific. And some of the suggestions that you'll see at the end of this presentation are derived from the entire group. So that's the origin of this document, which I'm going to present today. I'm going to sort of frame the rest of this presentation as the 5 premises, 2 tools framework. So there are 5 premises to this approach that we're suggesting. And then there are 2 tools we're using, 2 analytical tools to try to break apart the challenge we're facing and provide that strategic framework that Lauren was suggesting we need. So let's just go through these premises quickly. And I think the bulk of our attention should really focus on the underlying argument. My clock has just gone off. Here we go. On the underlying argument of the causation in the system. So first of all, the problems facing Canada, and I realize a lot of people at the back can't read this, so I'm going to make sure you all know what's on the slides, because I was at the back earlier. The problems facing Canada and weakening our democracy are so diverse and complex that it's difficult to know where or how to start fixing them. This is what Lauren and I realized in Montreal at the end of January. We need fundamentally a systems lens to understand these problems and implement effective responses. It's very valuable to look at the parts, but we need to look ultimately at the whole and how the parts link together and how they affect each other. And this is where the kind of radical interdisciplinary approach and the complex systems approach that the Cascade Institute uses might be of some value. So the second premise is that, and I think this reflects much of the conversation today, although I suspect it's a little bit more in line with Michael Bonner's arguments than perhaps some of the other people in the morning panel. Democracy is far more than the institutions and procedural rules of elections. It is fundamentally an ensemble of beliefs, moral commitments, and practices, all of which can be strong and resilient only if embedded in a thriving economy and society. And that leads more or less logically to the next premise, which is that revitalizing and defending our democracy requires a whole of society response from our communities, through our diverse regions, and across the entire nation. And oh, by the way, since we're fighting a critical battle for the defense of liberal democracy in the world, if we do this right, much of the rest of the world can learn from us. So this document that we're discussing right now has been circulated quite widely in the United States. The analysis is equally applicable to the United States. The causal dynamics in the United States as here, and quite possibly the framework approach to responding is applicable too. So that's the third whole of society response premise. Fourth, The Cascade Institute's framework for revitalizing and defending democracy is strategic. And it's strategic. I taught peace and conflict studies across the road at University College for 15 years. It's strategic in the military sense, that you are reflecting on the larger picture of the war you are engaged in, and you are thinking about the potential responses of other actors, perhaps antagonistic actors in that war, and how they're going to respond to your response. So it's highly reflective. I think that you think that I think that you think that I think that you're going to do this, and so I'm going to do that, right? There are these loops of reflectivity in this kind of analysis that are really important. The other way this action plan that we are proposing is strategic is that it highlights the individual interventions that are possible and how they're situated in society, in Canadian society, but then shows how they can be potentially linked together into something far more important and powerful than the individual parts, even adding up the individual impacts. So this goes to a concept that is fundamental in complexity science called emergence, which is the idea that sometimes the whole is more than the sum of the parts. We need to make the whole of our package or set of interventions more than the sum of the parts. We need to be looking for those interaction effects, the synergies that can be achieved between different interventions across these different target points within our society. Now, there have been a lot of very good suggestions put forward since the depth and severity of this crisis have been recognized in the last 3 months or so across the political spectrum. On the right, we have Build Canada, which is a kind of a tech bro website, but there's suggestion paper and article after article on that website for things that Canada could do to make its economy especially stronger. And in the center, we have Adam Radwanski in the Globe and Mail this past weekend, I believe, or maybe the weekend before, with a full-page folio of different suggestions for how Canada can use its energy resources to revitalize its economy. And then we have other suggestions, ideas. Here today, I think, is doing a series of cross-country conversations to elicit suggestions from Canadians for interventions. All wonderful, good, important, but we right at the moment have no way of sorting among them and figuring out how they fit together. And so this plan is the framework is more important than the suggestions. At the end, on the last screen, you'll see we have 18 suggestions, but those are just illustrative. It's the framework that counts because it tells us hopefully how we can link the pieces together into something that is more than the sum of the parts, that has that kind of emergent property that I was talking about before. So 5, and this is really fundamental. This is at the core of the Cascade Institute ethos, I guess you could say. Accurate diagnosis must precede effective prescription. We need to correctly understand what ails Canadian democracy before we try to intervene to strengthen it. Now, I think what happens with many of the suggestions that people have proposed is they have in the background kind of a proto-theory of what the problem is. Probably that theory is not wrong, but it's not complete. Inevitably, it's not complete, often because it hasn't been effectively surfaced so that it can be adjudicated or examined by others, and perhaps integrated with other explanations of the causation. So you may not agree with the 4 processes that I'm going to present in a moment, but the underlying idea that we have to get the causation right is one that I think is indisputable. And then we can figure out where the highest value interventions are, those with the highest expected utility, to use that economist phrase, where there's the combination of both probability and potential positive impact that gives you, in a sense, the highest score in the ranking of all the possible interventions. We need to be looking for the highest expected utility, positive expected utility. Okay, so let's charge ahead. Those are the 5 premises. Now let's get into the tools. Cascade Institute uses 2 analytical tools to diagnose the forces weakening our democracy and to identify where and how Canadians can address those forces. Now, I don't want to pretend that we suddenly invented this at the end of January. the four causal processes is part of what I was presenting with Lauren in Montreal, the four causal processes driving polarization, although they've been modified a little bit since then. That's one of the tools, this analysis of four causal processes. Right there, a deep analysis of the drivers of ideological polarization, social division, populism, and democratic decline in Canada, the US, and other Western societies. And the other tool is one that has been at the core of the Cascade Institute. Oh, excuse me, slide I forgot was there. These four drivers of democratic decline have labels, which you'll see in a moment: economic precarity, ingenuity gap, message distortion, and the fragmentation of belief communities. I'll come back to those in a moment. So that's the first tool. The next tool is what we call WIT analysis, worldviews, institutions, and technologies. This is based on a seminal article that was published by Robert Costanza at Columbia University back around 2009 with his research group. It's actually, the lead author is Rachel Badeau. And that article argues that societies are structured around tightly integrated sets of worldviews, institutions, and technologies. They call them WIT sets. Basically, sets of belief and value commitments that reinforce and are reinforced by institutional commitments, rules of the road, broadly speaking, that are themselves themselves reinforce and are reinforced by, so ergo the double-headed arrows there, it's all reciprocal, by technological commitments. The underlying premise here is that that societies basically reproduce themselves by passing these WIT sets on through time. And some of them turn out to be evolutionarily fit, and some of them aren't and are weeded out. One thing that happens is that the particular WIT commitments that you have sometimes become maladapted to a changing environment. So this sounds very abstract. Let me give you an example. Our Canadian health system is grounded in certain value and belief commitments that I think most of us in this room share very strongly. The idea that health is a human right, for example. The idea that the whole of society is responsible for funding adequate access to health care for every member of our society. We take those kind of for granted, but they're actually quite radical. Looking at historical circumstance, I think they're actually quite radical if you just go about 200 kilometers that way. Or 200 miles if we want to get the language right. So those are worldview commitments. Those worldview commitments are themselves reflected in institutions of public funding for healthcare. Under siege, but still standing. Public funding of healthcare, including, I think I've just lost. Okay, yeah. Public funding for healthcare, including public funding of hospitals, and you can think of hospitals as technologies. They are ensembles of complex technologies, from GATCH beds to MRI machines to the social technology of the alert metrics, of the alert sounds that go across, and James knows all about this, that go across the PA regularly when they're there. I can't make all the codes out, black, brown, red, green, but that's a technology in itself. And these technologies in Canada are institutionally supported by the institution of public funding, and those institutions are themselves supported by the commitments to certain values we have. All that seems actually pretty straightforward, right? But the implication here is that if you want to make a change for the better in a WIT set that is powerful within a given society, and I could go through a number of examples of what WIT sets are, I've just given you one, you actually need to think about intervening simultaneously in all parts of this cycle to achieve synergies across the worldviews, the institutions, and the technologies. That if you neglect part of the set, then it's likely that your interventions are not going to be effective. And that's a starting premise for all the work that we do on the intervention side at the Cascade Institute. We structure all our work around worldviews, institutions, and technologies. We have a technology program. We have a worldview program. We have programs that integrate institutions across all the rest of our programs. So those are the two tools, the deep analysis of the causation and the wit analysis. I'm not going to say any more about the wit analysis. I think you've got that. And we're going to focus in particular on the causal analysis. But before I do, let me just jump to the framework because it's kind of the guts of the whole thing, right? What you can do then is you can disaggregate the challenge that Canada faces with respect to its democracy by producing a table like this. And for those of you at the back who can't see properly, you can probably see just the top of it. It says a framework to identify interventions to revitalize and defend Canadian democracy. So you want to identify interventions that reduce economic precarity. There's one column there. Close the ingenuity gap, mitigate message distortion, and reverse fragmentation of belief communities. So I'm going to go through each of those causal processes. And then you disaggregate each of those causal processes by whether your intervention impacts principally worldview components, institutional components, or technological components. It's actually quite straightforward, right? Now, there's another element. So this is a 12-cell matrix or strategic framework that gives us some purchase on where our interventions should be located, how they're acting, and how they can be integrated. But you can also think that these interventions could proceed at the community level, 3 levels of analysis: community, regional, provincial, and national, right? So originally in the first version of this paper, I had a rectangular prism. I didn't know that term before. I said, so what's a 3-dimensional rectangle? And I think Kate said, our daughter said, oh, it's a rectangular prism. Did you know that? And so you can have a rectangular prism, which basically has, in a sense, this table on top and then is disaggregated by the 3 levels. And that gives you 36 intervention points for Canada. So you can think of an intervention that acts on reducing economic precarity at the institutional level within communities, right? That's a cell within that 36-cell rectangular prism. But we aren't going to look at the rectangular prism. We're just going to look at the 12 cells, which is all we need at this point. Okay, so let's get into the details of the causal analysis. Now, I want to be clear about this. These are hypotheses. In fact, we weren't actually anticipating at the Cascade Institute that we would be running all this stuff out quite quickly as soon as we are, right? We were in Montreal in part to see if we could find the resources to continue with research in this area. But in a sense, our hand has been forced. We need to move quickly. The 4 causal hypotheses that I'm putting forward, the 4 causal processes, have actually, they reflect research in some cases going back decades. They're a pretty good start. They're all open to revision, depending on people's input here and in other conversations. So we are proposing these causal processes as a starting point in our deeper diagnosis of the challenge that Canada is facing. Okay, so the drivers of democratic decline, again, the 4 causal processes are economic precarity, ingenuity gap, message distortion, and fragmentation of belief communities. Now, I'm going to go through these in terms of vertical columns, and I'll read these for folks if you can't see them at the back, which you probably can. But I want to say that we start with processes that are substantially material, that are relatively well understood. And as we move across the screen towards the right to the 4th process, we end up with processes that are substantially ideational. In other words, they happen in people's heads, and they're much less well understood. But that doesn't mean they're any less powerful. Now, this first process, as you can say, is what we call the economic precarity processes, and this is something that's actually really well understood. That there have been various changes in the technologies of economic production that have in turn increased returns to ideational capital, basically to ideas and knowledge, and decreased returns to labor, especially physical labor, There have been a lot of other things that are going on, including the broadening of markets around the world, which tend to create, that process has tended to create a winner-take-all global economy. But these technological changes in general have tended to widen income and wealth gaps within our society. And there, as I said, there's been a lot of work on this. Just a couple of examples. Thomas Piketty, his book Capital, White Rural Rage by Schaller and Waldman. They're just a lot of very good work here. So these things I think we understand fairly well. What I don't think is so well understood is just how powerful and pervasive some of these changes have been. As a complexity scientist, I am not somebody who reflexively turns to a single variable to explain complex social phenomena, almost by definition. But if I were asked to point to one thing that I think has been driving the rise of people like Donald Trump, it would be this general process, and in particular, what we see in this graph here, which shows real per capita, the decline of real per capita GDP in high-income countries going back to 1960. Now, the reason you don't see these data mostly is because we've done something a little bit unusual with them. As complexity scientists, we realize that sometimes complex systems have kind of exogenous shocks and phenomena. They become unstable for one reason or another. So we extracted all the years, and there's a list at the bottom there that you can see, 74 to 76, the first OPEC oil shock, 1980 to 83, the second OPEC oil shock, 1990 to 92, the savings and loans crisis, 2001 to 2003, the East Asian financial crisis, and then the dot-com panic, 2008 to 2010, the Great Recession, and 2020 to 2021, the pandemic crisis. We've actually extracted all those outliers to see the signal more clearly, because those were shocks like the pandemic, for example, that didn't reflect internal dynamics of economies for the most part. Although I could make an argument where they do, but I'm going to leave that aside for the time being. And what you see there is a really striking decline in real per capita income from over 4% to just over 1% in a 60-year period. And for those of you who know statistics and are into statistics, the R-squared is about 0.6, which for social science R-squared is kind of off the charts, right? So there are a lot of explanations for why this is happening. I think the go-to person is Robert Gordon at Northwestern University, who wrote a book back in 2012 called The Headwinds for Economic Growth. We can talk about the underlying processes. Climate change is now a significant factor here. It's sucking trillions of dollars out of the global economy. The poly-crisis is costing us a lot now. But there are other things that have happened, some of which may be reversible, but probably on balance, not. This looks like a long-term trend, and it's probably independent of AI, and we can have a conversation about that, because a lot of people look to new technologies like AI as the savior of the growth. Now, I have to say that there are a lot of problems with GDP as a measure of anything, right? It doesn't effectively measure, for instance, environmental externalities. But what this basically means in general terms is that as there's been less wealth to share, as economies have been generating less real wealth per capita or less growth in wealth per capita, powerful interest groups, what economists would call rent seekers, use their power to capture the regulatory and the subsidy environment, et cetera, and use that power to basically sustain their share of the pie at a constant rate. So the load, the cost, and even they can even sustain their share of the pie at an increasing. It's still getting bigger in size. And so the cost of the less wealth to share around is borne disproportionately by weaker groups and less politically powerful groups, as we heard, for instance, from, I think, Dennis earlier in the society. And so this is it's very straight connection to rising inequality and in both income and wealth within our societies. Okay, so that's causal process number one. Causal process number two. I'm going fast. Happy to have some conversation about this in a few minutes. But part of the project as we go forward is to unpack these causal processes in more detail. This is labeled the ingenuity gap. This goes back to the book that I wrote when I was at the University of Toronto and published in 2000. And it basically makes the argument that in general, looking across the problems that humanity is facing, and it's certainly true within individual societies like Canada, that the difficulty of our problems is rising faster than the delivery of solutions to those problems. And I have a very specific way of thinking about both problem delivery and solution delivery. I think in terms of basically the rate at which algorithms are delivered, problem-solving algorithms. You can think of them as recipes to solve our problems, social and technological problems. And you can measure the difficulty of a problem, too, by the minimum length of an algorithm or a recipe that would solve that problem. So there is a tractable way of thinking about whether our problems are getting harder and whether we're keeping up with solving them. That's the short form of the story. And just to go ahead, in the ingenuity gap, I had this chart, which still serves good purpose. It shows that over time, there's this rising gap between our need for those algorithms, for those recipes, and our ability to supply them when and where they're needed in adequate amounts. For a variety of reasons, this did my sound just go off? No, it's back. For a variety of reasons, this analytical approach simplifies a lot of challenges that economists face when it comes to, for instance, understanding the social mechanisms of innovation within societies. Well, what does this do, the ingenuity gap? Well, as our societies don't solve problems effectively, and people can see that. We can see our healthcare system not working properly. We can see housing supply not keeping up with demand. We see that that we're not dealing effectively with incoming migrant flows into the country. And what happens is that people quite understandably look around for people to blame. And the people who are supposed to be taking care of us and solving these problems are our technocratic and managerial elites. And we've given them a lot of power and authority. We've given them good salaries and often fancy positions and a great deal of deference. And quite reasonably, people look at these folks and say, well, why are you getting all of this social and economic status and you're not actually keeping us safe and secure? And so it leads over time to a delegitimization of political and managerial elites and all of the knowledge and epistemic apparatus that they use, including the scientific and technical language that they use. Okay? So that's the second process. The third process, this one is more complex, and we can talk about the complexity if you like in Q&A, but this is what we decided in the course of conversations in early February to call message distortion. And it's a function of a number of factors, but they all relate fundamentally to the way we process messages and the way social media are affecting the processing of messages within our societies. So just to step back, we are in a sui generis period for the species, and I think we've forgotten that, partly because of something that I think, who was it who was talking about it? Oh, Peter, you were talking about our habituation, our tendency to adjust our baseline. We forget that when I was over at University College in early 1990, in the early 1990s, before the World Wide Web really was widely used, we probably as individuals had access to hundreds of millions, if not billions of fold less information that each one of us individually has access to now. So there's one of the figures I'm not going to show today, at least a 10 to the 9th, i.e. billion-fold increase in the amount of information that's available to individuals. Now, that's not that we're accessing all that information, but I don't know about your inbox. My inbox currently has over 900 unanswered emails in it. Much of this information is piling up at the doorsteps of our cerebral cortexes. This basic processing power has not improved, right? And so one of the results in that kind of information environment of extreme attention scarcity is that we shorten our messages. But we're in an environment where we want to make sure our messages get attention, especially a social media environment that accentuates status anxiety. And oh, by the way, it's status anxiety that the big social media companies use to get us to click. They're saying you don't have enough friends, you don't have enough followers and the like, right? And so one of the things we do in a social media environment where we have accentuated status anxiety, and everybody is overloaded with information, is that we shorten those messages as short as possible, ergo X, and we pump them up with negative emotions, fear, anger, disgust, because they're sticky, well established in psychological research. They travel well. And we target those negative emotions, fear, anger, and disgust against outgroups because we want to build our status within our in-group, so we say derogatory things about other groups in society. So that's a factor or a set of processes that affects, we think broadly, message dissemination, message production. But there's another thing too that happens on the reception side, message reception. So here we have all this information that's piling up around us, let's say in your inbox or in your feed of some kind, your social media feed. I'll just give you an example. In those 900 messages I've got, there are probably 50 that I could benefit from enormously if I actually found them and paid attention to them. But they're from people where I'd have to have a conversation because there's an interface issue. Maybe I have to figure out how to communicate with them. We have to sort of come to agreement to some common understanding of what the issue is, and then we can have a conversation. Or it's a long message, and I have to respond with something of a long message. And instead, I don't. I respond to all the people I know well, where the interface problem is really limited, where I can communicate fast. So this is what this problem of message reception, where people don't respond to people who are unlike them, but respond to people who are like them, encourages what complexity scientists call homophilic connections, basically connections to like others within the network. So you've got a problem on the message production side, and you've got a problem on the message reception side that together reinforce each other and bias a lot of our communication towards negativity, emotional negativity, short messages, and towards us making connections and communicating with people who are like us. It's a product of a technological revolution, sort of the unanticipated consequences of a technological revolution. In my book, The Upside of Down, which was published again when I was at the University of Toronto in 2005, in my prescriptive section at the end, I said, like a lot of people were saying at the time, that collective intelligence was going to be the thing that would save humankind. We're all networked together. We're going to be all connected together in this global noosphere, and there'll be an emergent collective intelligence. Well, I have never been so badly falsified in any prediction I've made in my life, but I'm not feeling terribly bad about that because just about everybody else was too. Very few of us anticipated the downsides of this explosion in information availability in combination with social media technologies. It's not just social media, by the way. Social media plays a role, but underneath all of that is this unbelievable surge in information availability, which is overwhelming us all. So that's the third process. And the fourth process is the one that we talk about the most and around which there's the most contention. Now notice we're moving, as I said, from the material on the left-hand side to ideational processes on the right. So this is something that I actually think is profoundly important and is almost entirely neglected, and that is and it's been referenced a few times in our conversation today, the erosion of our shared understanding of reality. What I'm now calling not anti-realism, but realism skepticism, right? The sense that, well, there are a lot of, in its most extreme form, it might be kind of anti-realism, that there are a lot of different possible realities out there, and this is mine, and I don't care what you think. Or this is mine, and mine's best, and you're all wrong. But there's been a progression over a number of decades across a number of disciplines, social sciences, philosophy, physics even, going back to the Copenhagen School, in popular culture. If you think about all of these movies that talk about alternative realities, that we can sort of either see through if we're trained well enough, like The Matrix, or flip between if we have the right way of thinking, as in everything everywhere all at once. The idea that somehow the reality we're in is not real, or there are multiple realities available, or that we should just be in general skepticism of any claims about reality. Or often on the right, you see my reality is right, and I can construct it any way I want. Somebody referenced this earlier, and everybody else is wrong. This erosion of a shared understanding of reality. I mean, bluntly, it makes solving problems like climate change a lot harder. How are you going to solve climate change? You can't even agree it's happening. Now, we have lost so much ground. This is one of the things that was motivating Ben to get into to run for the Greens. We've lost so much ground in the last 6 months on climate change. It is breathtaking. For all intents and purposes, humanity has given up on this problem. And it is going to wreck our societies, right? And so, but it's partly because it's like we've decided we're not going to talk about this. It's because there's just too much disagreement. There's too much, what happens, and it's in the second bubble there, you get this proliferation of identity truth bubbles. Groups of people who have their own sources of knowledge, their own experts, their own journals, their own ontological premises about life, their own basic, about the world, their commitments to the basic constituent features of the world. This is what we used to call, and we still do internally, epistemic fragmentation. It's a fragmentation of the capacity to arrive at commonly adjudicated decisions about what reality is and what decisions we should make in that reality. We're a long way down this road right now, and it's really being reinforced by popular culture and by technologies, AI, massively multiplayer games, and the metaverse and the like. And people increasingly retreat in their isolated little worlds, and that becomes their reality. Good luck when the server farms go down, but that's another story. All right, so let's make sure we have a little bit of time for conversations. So very quickly, you've probably been saying, oh, these things are all linked together, and we acknowledge that. So I put some examples of relationships, just keeping them kind of symmetrical and aesthetically pleasing. But when we actually do this at the Cascade Institute, we've got arrows pointing everywhere. Everything's connected with everything. So there are self-reinforcing phenomena here that are extremely important between these different pathways. Underneath this, all four of these pathways then start to converge in certain common features. They create a social selection environment. Remember, I used this kind of neo-Darwinistic idea of a social selection environment before, that favors opportunistic actors who are willing to leverage intergroup conflict to accumulate social, economic, and political power. Anybody come to mind? And that, in turn, leads to worsening ideological polarization, deepened social divisions, greater likelihood of dehumanization dynamics, rising populism, and weakened democratic governance. That's our first set of hypotheses. Open to revision. Love to have your comments. Please, I probably won't be able to meet you today, but I'd be delighted to receive your comments by email or have a Zoom call or something. Okay, so now you're not going to be able to read this, don't worry. Now you can take the WIT framework and the causal process framework, and you've got your 12 cells, and what I told the team was I want you to go out and start generating ideas for different interventions to revitalize and defend democracy that fit in all of those 12 cells. We came up with 18 possibilities. We had this huge whiteboard online, and people were putting in ideas. And I explicitly said, I want anybody from any reasonable ideological perspective, and I guess you need to underline reasonable nowadays, any reasonable ideological perspective to be able to look at this table and see themselves in it somewhere, right? So the way this works, again, it's like the previous table, examples of interventions to revitalize Canadian democracy. Interventions to, in the first column, reduce economic precarity, close the ingenuity gap, mitigate message distortion, reverse fragmentation of belief communities, operating on worldviews, institutions, technologies. I'm just going to go through very quickly 4 illustrative examples. These are purely illustrative. If you think this is useful, take the idea, start plugging in things yourself. It's an interesting exercise. But I'm going to look at 4 quickly, just to give you a sense for the kinds of things we've been talking about. The first one is this guy down at the bottom, and that's hands-on democracy. And the suggestion here is and we got a little box to fill in, so we can't say a lot, right? Prototype and test new approaches and new technologies for citizens, assemblies, and participatory budgeting to increase democratic participation and legitimacy at the municipal level. Now, that's an intervention. That's an intervention that operates it's operating, if you look at the whole table, it's operating to close the ingenuity gap. In other words, it's raising the capacity of communities to solve their problems. It's operating at the technology level because this is the implementation of social and perhaps communication technologies. And it's operating at the community level. So it's community, technology, closing the ingenuity gap, right? Here's another one. Now, in this case, we're looking at reversing the fragmentation of belief communities at the institutional level. The idea here, we titled Serve the Nation, establish a one-year national service program for young post-secondary Canadians, stipulating residence outside one's province, so you get some exposure to the rest of the country, with varied, but including military reserve and climate corps service options operating at the national level. I should say that this links into an intervention we suggest elsewhere in the table that would shift the orientation of national military spending and includes standing up a National Defense Corps and Homeland Defense, which is something I've also been writing about recently. So there's a synergy just right there between two of the things we're suggesting within the table. Third suggestion, this one being in the mitigate message distortion worldviews cell. Disinformation inoculation, revamp education curricula to teach critical engagement with online news, troll farms, disinformation, and AI. That has to be regional. Education is a provincial responsibility, so that's where this kicks in. And then finally, a plug for something we're doing, because I can't resist. And this is down in the bottom left-hand corner, reducing economic precarity, technology, national and regional. This is geothermal moonshot. I happen to think that we happen to think that Canada is unbelievably well positioned to be a leader in deep geothermal technology, which could actually kind of solve our climate problem. Create public-private partnerships for an integrated set of experimental drilling sites and diverse geologies in Canada to drop the cost of deep geothermal power as part of a broader energy diversification strategy to give Canada expertise and technology it can sell worldwide. That's an off-ramp for Alberta, basically, for the oil and gas companies in Alberta, because it uses drilling technology, and they're really good at drilling. So there you go. That's how this works, and I'd be really happy to get your feedback, and we still have a few minutes for conversation. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Do we need to circulate a mic so that, Danielle, do we need to circulate a mic?
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
To begin with, thank you for a very interesting, compelling.
Mic's not on.
There's probably a button on it to.
Thank you for a very interesting, compelling advancement. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. And I can repeat the question if necessary.
Required, in my humble opinion, is political leadership transformative, willing to make the tough, ontologic, epistemic issues without fear or favor, regardless of political antecedents, regardless of initial hue and cry, to stand firm and say, this is what we must do, and not necessarily say, trust me, but surround yourself with people that tell you what you don't want to hear, but they can justify it and say it in terms of your regard. Leaders have arrogance, they have hubris, but they need to be surrounded by people that will provide them with what I call a balance.
Yeah, okay, so I agree partly, okay? I think the political will argument is a kind of the catch-all explanation. Oh, well, we just don't have political will, right? And by the way, I agree wholeheartedly with your idea that leaders need to include in their circle of advisors people who are specifically designated to test any proposals that are going forward. The classic example being Jack Kennedy's ex-com during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he told his brother, I want you to be the devil's advocate in this process. I think that's in these complex problems and situations, you need to constantly stress test ideas and suggestions, and you need to be prepared to experiment, to get new information so that you can course adjust. This, by the way, this process of course adjustment is not understood by the general public. It was really clear during the COVID pandemic just tell us what to do and then stick with it. But of course, we were learning as on the go, because they didn't know, for instance, that COVID wasn't communicated by surfaces. Remember when we were cleaning all our groceries and stuff, and some of us were. And then it turns out that's not important, but it turns out it was aerosol, but institutionally nobody wanted to talk about it being transmitted by aerosol transmission. But so there were these problems with learning as the science progressed that required course corrections. And then, and it goes to the ingenuity cap problem, there were deeply entrenched existing commitments to certain ways of doing things that people didn't want to change. And that was what prevented many of these institutions from accepting, health institutions from accepting aerosol transmission of SARS-CoV-2. So here's the thing. My broader response to your injunction is that, any leader who goes whole hog in that way won't be a leader for very long, right? They're going to get kicked out of office, unless for some reason they've abridged democracy, set up an authoritarian regime, have all the institutions of coercion already in place to crack heads, and then they can do whatever they want, which is clearly what Trump wants to do. But any democratic leader who says, I'm just going to do this and I don't care what you think, is going to get kicked out of office. Leadership involves explaining to people why something is in their best interests. Right? And that means, and it's an educational process. I mean, it's been marvelous to see Ben interacting with people on street corners and on doorsteps and in these all candidates meeting. You can see that democracy actually works because people are struggling to figure out answers. They're asking for answers. And if it's working properly, there's a dialogue that's going back and forth, because nobody at the top is ever going to have all the right ideas. It's a crazy source from this inspiration, but Napoleon had this aphorism that he used. He said, I'm only going to mention this guy once because he was a brutal dictator, but he did say that every private has a general's baton in his knapsack, right? And it's always stuck with me because you never know where you're going to find a good idea or a good person. Right? If somebody who's really good at solving a problem or has the breakthrough idea, perhaps almost certainly in combination with something else somewhere else. Most innovation, dramatic innovation, comes from combinations of technologies, ideas, institutions, rules, procedures that have not been combined somewhere. But you never know where that's going to happen. So a leader is listening all the time and then seeing, reading much like a good chair of a meeting, is drawing out the consensus, drawing out a decision so that it feels like it's the group's decision, right? But actually the leader is always 5 steps ahead, understanding that complex landscape and then moving the group as a whole forward. So with that caveat, I'd say sure. Yeah, hi.
But
and Sanford, I knew you'd say that. So
Ted and I have had this discussion since he first came to University of Toronto into political science. But what I want to say is that I'm going to mention one factor which I think is very important in determining whether democracies decline. And I know you're going to tell me that it's included in one of your categories, but you can tell me which one it is.
Okay.
And that's immigration, because in Europe and United States, the debate about immigration is just very crucial between right and left. And I wonder, is it message distortion under which you include immigration, or what?
No, it would be under the ingenuity gap, but then it's distorted and stuff. And also, immigration, people don't like to leave their homelands unless there's a critical crisis. So if you look at this globally, there's been economic crisis or war elsewhere, and we're not doing an effective job as wealthy nations in helping those problems, helping address those problems. But within Canada, I think that certain decisions that were made about managing what was inevitably going to be a huge flux of immigration, we could see this coming, seeing the changes in the world, were really bad decisions. And there was an idea out there for a while that the faster we grow our immigration streams, the better off Canada will be. It was a very simple correlation. I happen to be a huge proponent of immigration, but there are issues relating to healthcare, housing, et cetera. And then to get to the second set of processes, this was the crisis that arose from immigration rates that exceeded our capacity to manage them was weaponized by certain elements within our societies through some of the techniques I was talking about under the third column. So I would put it principally in those two places. There was an underlying failure of problem solving, and then that the consequences, the pernicious consequences, were accentuated and used as a political weapon by people on the right of the political spectrum. Does that?
Thanks. I thought you'd find it. You located somewhere. I wasn't quite sure
by the way,
where.
I would say, by the way, that there is no better correlation currently to the distemper in our societies and the relationship between unmanaged immigration and the rise of right-wing populism. So I was practically screaming at my computer monitor for 18 months, 2 years before all this problem. I said, you've got to get this problem under control, right? And that doesn't mean you're not letting people in. It doesn't mean that you aren't sensitive to the needs of the refugees and others in the world, but it means that there's a demonstration to the Canadian public that we have this under control and it's deliberate and we are thinking of your interests first. And so it did enormous damage to democratic legitimacy.
Sorry, we're going to have 2 more questions.
There's one over here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk today. I have a follow-up question to the gentleman's question. How has the Cascade Institute looked at, the issue of immigration? You've given some, some solutions with respect to environmental, but I'm wondering how you look at immigration and how can we go about looking at that issue?
Sure. Well, we take a global perspective on this within the context of our Polycrisis project, which is a project that, again, asks the question and tries to understand why so many things are going wrong simultaneously. Massive migrations are a signal, like a canary in the coal mine, that systems are failing in the sending societies for the most part. There's some pull. There's always a push and a pull. But the dramatic surge in migrations we're seeing is substantially a result of economic crisis, war, environmental crisis in the sending societies. So I guess the larger story we would tell, and it's one that is antithetical to the position of people like Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and others, is that we actually can't address a lot of these problems as isolated communities. Whether it's climate, the rising incidence of zoonotic viral disease, massive migration movements, these are planetary processes. We are getting a very brutal lesson in shared fate on this planet as a species. And it's not clear which way we're going to tip. We would argue for a strong multilateral response, and we do in some of our. So that means rebuilding the rules-based multilateral order with the institutions strengthened like the WHO and others that help stabilize these societies and rebuild the economies of these societies. Marcus G. published a piece in the Globe and Mail this past weekend, you might have seen, where he said, basically, everything is pretty good, guys. Well, let's wait a year after we see the impact of the collapse of the gutting of USAID. And because no matter how well-meaning the rest of the world is, we're not going to be able to step in to fill the United States gap, right? That hole that's left there. So we're going to see almost inevitably a dramatic spike in infant mortality, economic crisis, and then over longer periods of time, decline in health and well-being in a lot of societies because, for instance, pandemic response has been gutted. And oh, by the way, a lot of the underlying stresses are getting worse in the meantime, like the climate stress. right? And so you've got to look at this holistically. You've got to think in terms of shared fate for humanity. And I guess one of the places where the Cascade Institute is focusing its attention is what would be the constituents of a normative shift that would support that sense around the world. A return to a commitment to a general well-being of humanity as a whole, realizing we can try to shut ourselves off, we can try to build walls around us, but the smoke is still going to come in from the burning boreal forests in Siberia. The zoonotic viral diseases are going to still come in, and people will try to get over the walls, right? So it's not, this is a failed prospect. All the people, and I'm starting to rant a bit, but all the people who think that they can fly to New Zealand and be in their gated houses with their private airstrips and stuff like that, or in their silos, all they get to achieve by trying to wall themselves off from the rest of the world is being able to watch the rest of the world collapse around them over a period of 2 decades. That sounds like fun, right? So maybe we should recognize that we're kind of all in this together. We're going to either live together or die together over an extended period of time, a century or more, and so let's figure out how we can solve these problems collectively. So that is our ultimate response. It's a normative W worldview response that should then underpin various institutional and technological interventions to try to reduce the push pressures in these countries. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, one last question.
Anybody over here, just in case I'm not looking? We got one more person here.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you. It feels to me like this is a really interesting matrix for collective problem solving, and thinking about potentially that we here might represent an identity bubble ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'd be interested in, when you are having conversations with maybe more skeptical constituencies in Canada, what kind of reaction you're getting and how you're approaching those.
Well, it's a great question, but we are adamantly nonpartisan, and we try to be as ideologically eclectic as possible. So within our team, we actually span quite a large ideological range. And within our advisory group, our scientific advisors, and also our board members, we span a wide ideological range. I can tell you one of our board members is a leading member of the Canadian technological community, IT community. And he thinks this is great. The key thing is to recognize that the matrix itself doesn't drive you in a particular ideological direction. You can start, for instance, under economic precarity, you can start talking about how we're going to fix Canada's innovation system. How are we going to deal with intellectual property, for instance, all the issues that Jim Balsillie has raised. There's no reason why, in principle, a lot of the arguments that are being made, for instance, reducing interprovincial trade barriers, increasing investment in innovation in Canada, a lot of those arguments that would tend to come from the right of the spectrum can't be included in places in that matrix. That's quite intentional, because otherwise we'll just be contributing to the problem, not mitigating it in any way. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, with that, please join me in thanking